Hello, and welcome to Eastern Roman History, the best source on the internet for the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. All of our information is based on primary sources and scholarship from leading historians. I am your host, Daniel Maynard. Today, I'd like to talk about the portrayal of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, in the popular turn-based strategy game Medieval Total War II. Why not talk more about emperors and things, I hear you say? The reason is it's a good exercise to see how a piece of history is researched and applied into a modern media that will likely be the first introduction to something like the Eastern Roman Empire for someone that has never heard about it before, rather than a history book. It also is an opportunity to affirm what they get right and explore what they get wrong. So the faction's description for the Byzantine Empire, as it's called in the game, is the Byzantine Empire, AD 1080 summer. Byzantium is the shadow that remains of the old Roman Empire. This is spot on. It is a mere shadow because despite retaining the civilized ways of the Roman legacy, the Byzantines have done little to further it. In fact, it is their reverence of the old ways that have brought the empire to a point of stagnation in a world that has gradually kept moving on. And they were off to such a good start. It is true that much of the knowledge of the ancient world did live on through the Eastern Roman Empire, but it is not true that they did nothing to further it. In the 9th to 10th centuries, a so-called Renaissance had occurred where the empire exploded into intellectual activity. Even before this, they had taken many steps to consolidate and expand upon ancient works. Leo VI, also known as Leo the Wise, wrote many amalgamations and new treatises on old works, such as his Tactica and the Book of the Epoch. The Tactica itself incorporated information from the Emperor Maurus's Strategicon and other works, as well as new information, especially regarding the Arabs. Leo the Mathematician revived the learning of many ancient philosophers such as Porphyry. Medical and astronomical works were also revived by him, as well as maths and history. Photius's Bibliotheca gives a good idea of what elite Byzantine men, and potentially women, were reading, and that there was a wide enough audience for such works to require a reading list. The invention of Greek fire and the popularization of the fork by Theophanou cannot simply be cast aside as doing little to further Rome's legacy. Now getting back to the background description. The differences between the thinking in Byzantium and the West were most profoundly highlighted with the Great Schism, the division of Christendom. This is true, although to some of the Byzantine authors, such as Psellus, the Great Schism is not even mentioned in his chronicle. This no less disproves what creative assemblies say here, but to contemporaries this may have just seemed like yet another schism with the Church in Rome, such as the Photian Schism. It is not until a little later that the schism becomes more apparent in Eastern sources. Now returning to the background. Despite boasting the world's trade capital and home of Orthodox Christianity in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire is well past its zenith and is now in steady decline. This is partially correct. Constantinople was more than just a trade capital, however. It was a bastion of learning, splendour, and as they rightly say, the Orthodox faith. It is also true that in 1080, Byzantium was right at the end of a long period of decline. Returning to the background, the outer regions of the empire have been slipping from the emperor's grasp for decades now. To the west, the Normans have taken southern Italy, and in the east, the Turks have moved into Asia Minor, after their decisive and terrible victory at Manzikert. This is also true. What they fail to mention is the numerous invasions by the Pechenegs from across the Danube, and also the many rebellions that took place by this point. In 1078 alone, Nikephoros Botaniates deposed Michael VII, and then had to fight off Nikephoros Bryennios and Nikephoros Basiliakes. In the summer of 1080, Nikephoros Melissenos also rebelled. Returning to the description, the latter of these two losses was the worst defeat the empire had suffered in its entire history. Perhaps a little hyperbolic, but Manzikert was certainly a turning point. After it, the Romans never again managed to reassert control over the whole of Asia Minor. Returning to the description, to make matters worse, general corruption, chaos, and dissent has led to some of the other provinces closer to home to rebel. The empire was struggling with corruption and dissent, and it was all Nikephoros III could do to keep the whole thing together in his advanced age. There was a rebellion in Bulgaria by two Paulicans, but that had already been crushed. Bulgaria should be owned by the player, really, from the start. It is not so much provinces, but people that were rebelling. These people were interested in removing the emperor and taking his place, not independence wars. Arguably, the greatest threat to Byzantium lies in its independence from Rome. There is significant risk that the lords of the West will consider the lands of Orthodox Christianity to be fair game unless the Pope decrees otherwise. It is a true irony that Constantinople may now have to appease Rome after becoming the new capital of the Roman Empire centuries ago. In 1080, this statement is not really true. If anything, Rome was anxious to help the Eastern Roman Empire. Both Pope Gregory VII and Urban II planned to do something to help the plight of the Eastern Christians following the disaster at Manzikert and their advance into Asia Minor. This is one of the main reasons for the First Crusade in 1095. The animosity between East and West developed later, during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, with the expulsion of the Venetians by Manuel I, the massacre of the Latins by Andronicus I, and the sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade. After this point, West and East became very hostile, but still could cooperate. An illustration of this later resentment of one another can be found in the reign of Michael VIII. In the Second Council of Lyon, from 1272 to 1274, the emperor agreed to union between the two churches, mainly to prevent Charles of Anjou, the ambitious French ruler of Sicily, from calling a crusade against the Orthodox Eastern Romans. Now finally returning to the last section of the background from medieval total war, if the Byzantine Empire is to once again become the dominant power of the East, then it will first need to reclaim its heartlands, wholly before encroaching upon the borders of another power. The Byzantine legacy is long and predominantly proud, but unless the emperor can turn things around in a hurry, it is a legacy that will soon end. A fun little ending there. So the campaign victory conditions are to take Rome and Jerusalem and 45 regions in the long campaign, which seems to play to the fact that the Byzantine Empire is the Roman Empire, and so a long-term goal is to retake Rome and Jerusalem. And the short campaign is to eliminate Venice and the Turks, which also makes sense since these two factions, which are portrayed in the game, are also the main threats to the Roman Empire historically out of the factions that are actually present in the game. The empire's starting position has 5 provinces: Cyprus, Thrace, northwestern Anatolia, East Greece, and the Peloponnese. They should really have Trebizond, possibly Cilicia, although Cilicia was practically independent at this point. It depends whether the vassalage of Philaetos Brachamios by Nikephoros III should be counted as being legitimate or not. That is to say, de jure, Brachamios' fiefdom would have been part of the Roman Empire, but in reality it had essentially become independent. The Romans also should own West Greece. Possibly they could have a Sicilian army outside to help portray the invasion of Robert Guiscard during this time. The Byzantine player should also have the provinces of Rhodes and Bulgaria, as well as Crete, which is oddly held by Venice. This won't be true until after 1204, when Venice gets 1/8 of the empire. The Crimea could also be a Byzantine possession, but is forgivably not. Their Anatolian land should also be much smaller, as by 1080 the Romans had practically been pushed out of Anatolia by the Turks. In addition, the emperor should be Nicephorus III, not Alexios I. Perhaps if they made Alexios faction heir, or have a special event for it, then this would be far more accurate, since Alexios did not become emperor until 1081. Coming to the units, the ships seem fine to me. They've got galleys and fire ships. The siege equipment seems fine, such as rams, catapults, and so on. I thought I would read an interesting passage from Emperor Maurus's Strategicon to help illustrate the sort of siege equipment that would have been used by the Romans at this point. The Strategicon, Book 10, Chapter 1. If there are houses of flammable material within the walls, fire-bearing arrows should be shot from various directions, especially if there is a strong wind blowing. Also, catapults should be used to hurl the so-called incendiary bombs. While the enemy is kept busy trying to extinguish the fires, set up ladders, if the ground permits, and climb up. In almost all sieges, catapults are useful, especially if it is difficult to get close by digging or piling up earth, or to get a battering ram in position. The army itself kind of looks like the 10th to 11th century Roman army, or at least structured that way. You have the fermata troops, essentially peasant farmers, such as the militia units and the Byzantine spearmen, which are quite early units and quite cheap, which can be upgraded. The inclusions of the Siphacon seems a nod to the fact that the empire sometimes resettled people such as the Uzeres and others in Roman land, and the increasing presence of Turkish mercenaries in the Byzantine army at this time. You then have the Tagmata-like troops, like the Trebizond archers and the Byzantine infantry and cavalry and lancers that you can use. These are far more professional and armoured troops, which was true of the Tagmata. The Laticon unit seems to be a nod to the heavy cavalry developed by Alexios I, mimicking the heavy cavalry utilised by the West at this time. However, they don't have any crossbowmen that Anakomnemnon says they had, and mercenaries were a very large part of their army. Perhaps a greater access or a few foreign-type units could have been added. Rightly, the Varangrian Guard are their special unit, being the Imperial Bodyguard. It's not perfect, but it's okay on the whole. At least they don't have any incendiary pigs. Otherwise, the Byzantine unit tree is fairly generic in its look, and perhaps if greater research had been put into it, could have been far more fleshed out. But it seems serviceable enough. I hope you found this enjoyable, and we'll see you next time.